Orlando, Florida single mother Angel Glenn does whatever it takes to support her toddler.
She was a stripper and men fawned over her.
But when she hooks up with a bad boy, Angel crosses over from a world of seduction into a life of crime.
Angel was trying to find herself and being intrigued by this young man who had money because he sold drugs.
She was very much in love with him. She had no idea that she was setting up a bloodbath.
And later, in Hershey, Pennsylvania, desperate housewife Carolyn King abandons her family in search of a fresh start, only to find her perfect match in a local convict.
They were just in love, infatuated, and smitten. I think she just wooed him in such a way that he just couldn't resist.
But it turns out to be a match made in hell for anyone who gets in the way of Carolyn and her man.
They had her stripped naked, placed the gun at her head, and pulled the trigger.
They were as thick as thieves. They would do anything for each other.
Orlando, Florida may be the happiest place on earth for some, but not for child of divorce Angel Glenn, who's kept on a short leash by her mother.
The breakup of the marriage might have caused her mom to be more sheltering of Angel.
A dutiful daughter and a model student, Angel seems to be destined for a life on the straight and narrow, until puberty hits and the good girl turns into a voluptuous teenager overnight.
For Angel, growing up in a home where her father wasn't a steady influence in her life perhaps put her at risk for being a little boy crazy. In other words, trying to find her father through as many male figures as she could.
And it doesn't take long for Angel to go from discovering boys to getting pregnant.
Angel had a baby when she was 18 years old, and the father of this little boy was not involved in her life.
Where are you going? She drops out of school, but her church-going mother blames the men Angel runs with for leading her astray.
There is this tendency for good girls to like bad boys, and it seems that Angel may have fallen prey to that particular pattern.
Determined to get her on the right track, Angel's mom tells her daughter she needs to get a job to support her son or get out of the house. But Angel knows her options are limited, and the only thing she believes she has going for herself are her looks.
She's a pretty girl, and pretty girls like attention. So Angel began to perform as a stripper at private parties.
Stripping yields quick, easy cash that you would out-earn your counterparts that are working at a local drive-in or a fast food restaurant.
And it's during a night out that Angel happens to attract the attention of 22-year-old twin brothers, Dante and Dante Hall.
They're very, very difficult to tell apart. The only distinctive feature is Dante has a tattoo on his neck, and it says, "Money ain't a thing."
Despite Dante's best efforts, Angel finds herself drawn to Dante, who seems to be the one in charge.
Dante was the more aggressive and certainly the more assertive of the two, and the two of them were dedicated to each other, but basically Dante followed Dante's lead.
Angel was very attracted to Dante because, unlike his twin, Dante was much, much more aggressive, much more the bad boy. And certainly Angel had this very rebellious spirit.
Not only are the Hall brothers identical twins, they share the same profession. Both are major cocaine dealers with a reputation for ruthlessness that is well known and feared throughout all of Orlando.
They had developed a certain clientele among the crack users in particular. And so people knew that if you wanted to buy crack, that you would go to see Dante and Dante.
Dante had this danger in his lifestyle that she just was drawn to.
The attraction is instant and mutual, and Angel and Dante dive into a relationship that lasts the entire summer.
They stayed together at various motels and would get together as much as they could.
Angel seems at ease as the girlfriend of a notorious drug dealer, leaving her son with her mother for long stretches to spend more time with Dante, who has now graduated from merely dealing drugs to robbing other drug dealers.
The one thing about choosing criminals as your victims is that criminals don't typically call the police for help.
Dante finds another way to make money as well, by helping himself to a cut of the money Angel makes from dancing.
And this became an opportunity for Angel to embed herself into his life, to be able to take care of him and give him the things that would sustain him.
Life goes on this way for several weeks. Until one day, when Angel receives a call from a man named Billy Robinson, a potential client Angel met a few days earlier.
But yeah, I could probably do that.
Billy and Angel met in Orlando, and Angel made it clear that she was willing to dance for money.
So you all are gonna take care of us then?
And so through Billy, this party got set up for Friday night at a place in Eustis, which is about an hour's drive away from Orlando. At one point, Billy told her, "You be sure to get your girls because we're going to be giving you a lot of money."
Dante is present and is overhearing both sides of the conversation via the speakerphone.
After hearing the phone call, Dante's thinking, guys with all that money to spend on strippers, they must be rolling in cash.
And Dante, the consummate businessman, comes up with a plan. He and his crew will rob the party, and Angel will serve as bait.
She willingly went along with it because that was her boyfriend, and Angel, at one level, understood that her boyfriend was potentially dangerous.
Dancer Angel Glenn and her boyfriend Dante Hall plan to rob a party of one of Angel's clients. All she has to do is follow Dante's lead.
Once Angel is inside the party, Dante and friends will enter the party to rob the patrons there.
Girl, get up. What are you doing?
That afternoon, Angel calls two girlfriends she's worked with before to dance at the party with her, while Dante calls his brother and they plan the robbery. Later that night, Angel and the girls make the hour-long drive to Eustis, followed by Dante, and a neighborhood friend.
Angel did not convey to the other dancers that a robbery was about to take place.
In no time, Angel and the girls are on the scene in Eustis, and the party is underway, while Dante and his crew sit tight in a car down the street.
The girls had started dancing, the guys were drinking, there was a little drug use in the party, so it was a very festive atmosphere.
But Angel never forgets the real why and who she's there for.
There were a number of phone calls back and forth between Dante and Angel. Dante was asking her, how many guys are there? Do they have guns? What room are you guys in? And he instructed her to try to entice everybody into one place, because of course it would be easier for them to control the crowd if they were all in one spot. So she did as she was instructed.
Girls were dancing, the girls were being tipped, the guys were drinking, they were laughing, joking, having a good time.
When Angel has everything set just the way Dante wants it, that's when he and his crew make their entrance.
Dante was the first one in the house, and he was armed with an assault rifle, an AK-47, which on the street they call a chapa. And right behind him were his brother, Dante and a third guy carrying 9mm pistols. And Dante ordered everybody to get on the ground. He said that if they didn't do what they were told, he was going to make this choppa dance.
Angel hits the floor with everyone else. And while she may be the one who set all this up, even she isn't prepared for what happens next.
Then as they were on the floor, they were also reaching for the money and the jewelry that they wanted for a reason that is still really not clear, other than the fact that perhaps he wanted to get the partygoers to understand he was serious. Dante fires off a couple rounds with the AK-47.
Dante fires at the concrete ceiling and the bullets ricochet, hitting several partygoers, killing a man named Anthony Blunt.
Dante continued to spray the place. His girlfriend, Angel, was in just as much danger as any of the other partygoers or the other dancers.
He disregards her safety, and that should have been a moment for Angel to have a second thought about the relationship that she has with Dante.
She probably didn't think that Dante was capable of such acts at that moment because she loved him.
So far, the take from the robbery is just under $1,500 and some jewelry, much less than Dante expected. He's not happy.
And he and his friends fired off a few rounds to emphasize that they meant business and they wanted the rest of the money. Keeson Evans, who was one of the higher-ups in the group, said, "All right, you want more money?
It's in the back of the shoebox."
Dante sends Dante to look for the money, which doesn't really exist.
Yo, nothing here.
When Dante returns to the main room empty-handed, Angel sees just how far Dante's willing to take this.
He's angry at the fact that one of the partygoers lied to him, and so at that moment he decides to teach the guy that lesson.
He locates Keeson and shoots him in the head.
Realizing there isn't going to be a larger payoff, Dante and his crew take off, leaving the girls behind.
I believe Angel was caught off guard, and that although she knew she was helping her boyfriend come in and rob some folks who were just there at the party, she did not expect that people were going to die as a result of it.
In all, 5 men were shot, 4 by ricocheting bullets, 1 fatally. And Keeson Evans was executed.
It's a complete miracle that anybody walked out of there. The fact that you had someone who was firing off an AK-47, it's amazing that anybody left that room.
Angel and the other girls, both in shock, flee the scene. On their way back to Orlando, Angel comes clean with her fellow dancers and admits to helping set up the robbery.
One of the girls says, "You're stupid. Why did you ever endanger our lives like this? You could have been killed. We could have been killed. Why would you do something like that?"
Angel says something like, "This is how Dante and I make money now."
Here is Angel involved in a situation where people were hurt and killed, and she's bragging about it to all of them. And this speaks to me of a process of dissociation.
After the girls make it back to Orlando, Angel and Dante reconnect.
She saw up close and personal what Dante was capable of doing. She was definitely afraid.
I think she realized what she stood to lose. 2 days later, one of the dancers provided the law enforcement officers with a break in the case.
And in the aftermath of their robbery gone wrong, Angel Glenn and Dante Hall are forced to choose between love or self-preservation. And later in Hershey, Pennsylvania, Carolyn King finds her soulmate in a soulless ex-con.
She's getting a high, she's getting excitement, she's getting a thrill. And so sometimes people keep seeking that pleasure, so they engage in the crime over and over.
That Angel Glenn set up led to 5 men being shot, including one man who had an estimated 20 entrance and exit wounds, and he still survived. What began as a raucous house party in Eustis, Florida, turned into a bloodbath after a robbery gone wrong, orchestrated by stripper Angel Glenn and her boyfriend, Dante Hall. Having made off with less than $1,500 in cash and some watches, gold chains, and rings, a disgruntled Dante orders Angel to pawn the jewelry.
Dante has an outstanding warrant for murder. And so if he were to pawn something in his name, that's something that might turn up in the system that shows that he is, 1, local, and 2, that he's been involved in a serious robbery where people died.
Angel does what she's told, sacrificing her anonymity and risking her freedom to please the love of her life.
It is a pretty stupid thing to do for Angel to put her name on a pawn slip for goods that are tied to a homicide.
It's quite clear from a psychological point of view that Angel just stopped thinking. She was just invested in this relationship with Dante, and she just was not looking at what her actions were and what the consequences were going to be.
But it's not the jewelry that implicates the couple. It's one of the other dancers who comes forward 3 nights after the robbery.
Danielle, one of the dancers, hears that 2 people died in the robbery, and she goes to the police to say that Angel and her boyfriend Dante were involved in the robbery where the 2 people died.
This was our first break in this case. Up until then, this was truly a whodunit.
2 days later, police track Angel down and bring her in for questioning. Dante is nowhere to be found.
I don't feel like talking right now.
The interrogation went on for several hours, and her demeanor was defiant and deceptive throughout.
Angel lied multiple times to the law enforcement officers, saying that she didn't have any information, and then once she said that she did have some information, she kept saying that Dante wasn't involved.
Angel lied to protect Dante several times during the investigation. Eventually, she went on to say that she lied only to protect her family, but it appears she lied in reality only to get more of Dante's love and to prove to him that she was worthy of all of his affection and love.
Angel quickly changes her mind upon learning she could face the death penalty.
In Florida, even though she didn't squeeze the trigger, didn't want anybody to be shot, she was instrumental in the robbery during which somebody got shot. And as a result, she is legally responsible for the homicides.
With the possibility of lethal injection or a life sentence in front of her, Angel Glenn strikes a deal. She confesses to setting up the robbery and gives police the name of the motel where Dante is currently hiding out.
Her mother influenced her to cooperate because her mom could talk to her about the possibility of never being able to see her son on the outside again, and that she would never get to raise him. And I'm sure that the maternal instinct at some point had an impact on her decision to cooperate.
Dante and his twin are arrested without incident. Angel is released on bond, with one of the conditions being that she not have any contact with Dante, who sits in jail awaiting trial. But Angel still loves him too much to stay away.
Dante received a number of letters from her, including photos, And one of them, she's got her ankle monitor on at the time. So we know that the picture was taken while she was out on bond.
Angel wanted to have her cake and eat it too. On the one hand, she still wanted to be part of Dante's life, even though she was told not to be in contact with him. But on the other hand, she also wanted her freedom, which is something that she had.
For violating the terms of her release, Angel is thrown back in jail, where she remains for several months until the Hall brothers go on trial.
There was no further communication of any sort between them.
Thanks to Angel's testimony, Dante and Dante Hall are found guilty on 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, armed robbery, and conspiracy. Dante is sentenced to death and is currently on death row. Dante gets life without parole. It's now Angel Glenn's turn to face the music. She's sentenced to 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder.
She did express that she was sorry for what happened. I think she was in love with the idea of being in love, and Dante embodied power for her, and she was attracted to the power.
Looking at Angel Glenn in her situation, is she a threat to society? Probably not. Not by herself. But however, watch out, because if she gets with someone who is dangerous, then that can have some really bad consequences.
When I first met Angel, she was a wannabe thug girlfriend. And soon that facade of the hard street girl fell away, because that really wasn't her lifestyle. The real Angel is actually a pretty nice person.
Angel Glenn's desire for adventure in her life drove her to commit senseless acts in the name of love. A fate destined to be shared by Hershey, Pennsylvania transplant Carolyn King, who falls for a man she's willing to do anything to hold on to. Raised by her grandparents in Virginia, Carolyn King's early years aren't the most ideal.
She grew up in a family that they didn't have the most money. There were some issues of sexual abuse, even I think some drug abuse involved.
Looking to correct a void in her life, Carolyn gets married at 20 and has 2 children. But after 6 years of marriage, she feels like her best years are falling behind her. At 26, Carolyn walks out on her family and hits the road in search of something new.
Having kids isn't something that you can undo. She must have felt trapped. Something must have been really wrong in that marriage, or with Carolyn herself.
What we call it in the field is structural dislocation. When either by force or by choice, they have attachment to their family, but it's not a true attachment, and they just up and leave and abandon them. And this is what we see with Carolyn.
But with limited means and no reliable transportation, Carolyn doesn't get very far, only making it to Hershey, Pennsylvania, some 200 miles away.
And she got a job working in a plant that broke down bulk candy into smaller packaging for retail purposes.
She didn't have family there. She didn't have friends there. She really had no contacts or connection.
The only thing Carolyn has is a job so routine, it leaves the restless 26-year-old wanting more. A desire shared by 20-year-old Brad Martin, a recent hire at the factory who helps take some of the edge off.
Brad was a handsome young man. You know, he was tall, very young, good-looking guy.
Still relatively new to the job herself, Carolyn forges an instant bond with Brad. who also happens to be serving time at the Lebanon County Prison just up the road.
Brad had been in and out of the county prison for a variety of drug charges, a burglary charge, and violated the terms of that probation and was reincarcerated for that.
He was serving a sentence of 6 to 23 months.
He was granted work release privileges that allowed him to go out and work for an 8-hour day and then return to the prison for overnight.
Though only on the job a few weeks, Brad has already made a new friend in Carolyn.
They started to develop a relationship, more than just a working relationship. They developed a romantic relationship.
She really liked him, and it didn't matter that he was on work release.
Carolyn thinks bad boy Bradley is just the ticket out of her humdrum life, and she's about to show just how far she's willing to go to keep this young man around.
They were willing to sacrifice any and everything, including someone else's life.
Carolyn was in love with Bradley, and she was under the influence of Bradley Martin.
Pennsylvania, 26-year-old Carolyn King falls head over heels for 20-year-old convict Brad Martin.
Carolyn was a good-looking African-American woman. Brad was a handsome young man. So, of course, there's those sexual urges.
But with their encounters limited to the workplace, tensions between them are about to reach a breaking point. So Brad puts in a request at the prison for a 4-hour furlough. Based on his good behavior, his request is granted.
Carolyn met Brad at the prison, and they went over to a motel that was fairly close.
The encounter is unlike anything either has experienced before.
We need to do this more often.
And it leaves Carolyn wanting more.
The intimacy that Carolyn and Brad had must have been so intense that they immediately formed this bond and needed one another, became dependent on one another. There was just absolutely no way that they were going to give up this relationship.
But there's only one way Carolyn and Brad can be together.
At the motel, they decided that Brad was not going to return to prison.
Carolyn has found what she was looking for, a new man. And she's determined not to let him go.
I can only speculate that it was Carolyn's ideal that he not return.
We don't have money, where are we gonna go?
Brad had a relatively short period of time to go till the completion of his probation violation and his release.
Carolyn and Brad want a fresh start, and to do that, they need money. Brad knows an easy mark, who they should be able to charm into helping them. 74-year-old retired florist, Guy Goodman, who lives in Palmyra, just one town over.
Guy was involved in the prison outreach through his church. That's how he got to meet Brad, and he was really just trying to help him.
Hey guys, Brad.
Brad tells Guy he's on a furlough and wants to see him. He takes the bait and invites Brad over.
Guy had written several letters to Brad and had gone to visit him at the county prison on a couple of occasions, trying to get Brad back on a correct path.
Carolyn and Brad hitch a ride to Guy's home, just a few miles from the motel.
I believe they shared some coffee. But somewhere during that meeting, the conversation changed from, how are you doing, to, I need money, I need you to help me.
I need some money.
Guy tried to reason with him, tried to get him to go back to the prison.
But by now, Brad has already missed his scheduled return time, making him a fugitive. He and Carolyn know they have to get out of Pennsylvania.
Brad kept asking for money to get out of town. Guy kept insisting that he should return to the prison and get his life straightened out.
And Bradley became angry and picked up a vase and hit him with it.
Guy Goodman is struck over the head with the vase, which knocks him to the floor, opens a pretty large gash and wound in the back of his head.
They took a telephone cord, wrapped it around his neck, tied it to his hands, and then also to his feet.
At the same time, they took a sheet of plastic and wrapped him in the sheet of plastic, then took a bedspread and wrapped that around him, and then a terry cloth robe that was wrapped around the exterior of all of that.
The brutality perpetrated against Guy by these two individuals, in many ways, was a representation as to what they felt was an obstacle that had been put in their way by society, by their past, and they would do anything at this point to keep moving on together in the future, even if it meant eliminating Guy brutally.
Leaving Guy Goodman to suffocate, Carolyn and Brad hunt around the house to get what they came for.
While he was dying, Carolyn and Brad pretty much ransacked the house.
They found his credit card, grabbed some checks out of his checkbook, found his car keys, and left.
In less than an hour, Carolyn and Brad have left Guy for dead, stolen his money and his car, and are on the run. With no destination in mind other than the need to get out of Pennsylvania, they head west.
They took his car and started driving, using his credit card, using his checkbook along the way.
They were shopping sprees, buying purses, cosmetics, just town after town after town.
Even though they're on the run, their desire for one another can't be denied.
They also spent money on women's undergarments. They would just go to stores and buy all of this stuff.
Brad's involved with this slightly older woman, Carolyn, and she has her feminine ways and feminine wiles. And so she knows by buying all this sexy lingerie, this is a way that she could represent herself to the utmost.
10 days later, Guy's body is found by a concerned neighbor, and police are called. Already on the lookout for escaped prisoner Brad Martin, it doesn't take long for detectives to put two and two together.
Guy had sent letters, and he also did a couple of visits to Brad while he was incarcerated.
We went back to the county, looked, and learned that there was written correspondence as well as visits between Guy and Bradley Martin, which gave us a pretty good lead that it was Bradley Martin who may have done this.
Now with Hershey police hot on their heels, the fugitives must stay one step ahead of authorities, and there's no end to the violence they will perpetrate.
They shot her, left her naked, alone, hoping that the coyotes and other animals would dispose of the body.
What Carolyn did for Brad can never be undone.
Love-struck murderers Carolyn King and Bradley Martin are on the lam after killing 74-year-old florist Guy Goodman in Palmyra, Pennsylvania. Still riding on Guy's dime, Carolyn and Brad make it to North Dakota when they decide to head south to Mexico.
It's not a short drive from North Dakota, and this was funded from Guy's credit cards.
But they don't get far, thanks to a vigilant motel clerk in Bismarck, North Dakota, suspicious of the couple who claimed to have no photo ID.
They attempted to check into a motel, and a clerk there had questioned the authenticity of and validity of their utilizing the card and pushed a code into the system which stopped its usage.
The couple then tries to use one of Guy Goodman's checks, only to find out his accounts have been closed. With rapidly diminishing funds, the two are pushed to the point of desperation.
They needed money. They needed it bad. and they weren't afraid to do whatever they had to.
Having killed Guy Goodman, Carolyn and Brad know they have nothing to lose. When they spot 59-year-old vacationer Donna Martz.
Donna lived in Devil's Lake, which was a couple of hours away from Bismarck, so she was traveling alone. She was well-dressed. She looked well-to-do.
They saw Donna Martz as another source to finance their escape. They followed her down the hallway.
As Donna arrived at her door and put the key in to unlock it, they came up behind her.
Carolyn pulls a knife on Donna and tells her to do what they say and nobody will get hurt.
Donna Martz had a car, plus she probably also had a fresh supply of money, credit cards, checks, maybe even cash.
They wanted to get to work, they wanted to start a new life and live happily ever after. And Donald just happened to be that one person there at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Carolyn and Brad force the petrified Donna into the trunk and take off south toward Mexico, one step closer to their dream of a life together. Over the next 5 days, Carolyn and Brad go on another spending spree, courtesy of Donna Martz. She's still in the trunk, surviving on what little food and water they give her.
They simply kept her alive, bound in the car, so that they could continue to use the resources of her credit cards and her cash.
They forced her to give them her PIN number. They went to the ATM, used her PIN to withdraw cash.
But after days in the trunk, a desperate Donna reaches her breaking point.
So she starts to make noise. And if you're in a parking lot at a mall or any type of store, that should get the attention of somebody. Unfortunately, it just got the attention of Brad and Carolyn.
A furious Carolyn gets behind the wheel and drives out to the middle of nowhere.
Carolyn and Bradley, who had kept Donna alive so they could use her funds, now reach a tipping point with her. She's acting out in the trunk, trying to draw attention to her plight, and she could possibly get them caught. And so at this point, they become enraged with her.
They pull her out of the trunk, they stab her, they make her strip naked.
And Donna's nightmare doesn't end there.
Only people without a conscience can take the life of a person so callously and leave them for the vermin to dispose of their transgression. Carolyn had told Brad that she was primarily a Native American Indian, and they were going to North Dakota to see her father on the reservation. It was not true, but it was one of Carolyn's means by which to control and manipulate Brad. So it gave them a destination to go head towards, was North Dakota.
Carolyn King and her boyfriend Bradley Martin take their multi-state crime spree to a whole new level in North Dakota when their hostage Donna Martz tries to get away.
They were very angry, and they sped away from the parking lot with Donna still in the trunk of the car and traveled down the interstate highway, got off, got Donna Martz out of the car, and had her stripped naked.
As Carolyn watches, Brad rapes Donna.
Carolyn, by allowing him to be able to do something so heinous to this woman, in many ways, Carolyn was raping this woman too.
They were able to purchase a gun while they were on the road.
They then placed the gun at her head. They then shot her, left her naked, alone, hoping that the coyotes and other animals would dispose of the body, and they proceeded on their way.
After killing Donna, they get back in her car, heading south to Mexico. Meanwhile, law enforcement across the country is teaming up to catch them.
Donna was reported missing when she didn't arrive home when she was supposed to. So naturally, her family, they became concerned.
Carolyn and Brad don't know it, but by the time they reach Nevada, the FBI agents working the Guy Goodman case have tracked them to the Bismarck Hotel in North Dakota, where Donna disappeared. And with the help of local law enforcement, they connect the dots between the two cases.
You had the local police departments from Pennsylvania collaborating with local police departments in Bismarck, collaborating with the FBI and federal agencies, all on a manhunt to track down Brad and Carolyn. And most of that was because they still figured, hey, if we track them down, there's a chance that Donna may be alive.
The task force calls every police department from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, with orders to find Donna's car. Their canvassing pays off only a few days later, once the couple reaches California.
Outside of San Diego, a California highway patrolman spotted their car.
As he got closer, the car began to speed up.
A desperate Carolyn knows if she and Brad are caught, they can kiss any dream of a life together goodbye.
Carolyn was driving the car, weaving in and out of traffic, going through stop signs and stoplights.
The chase comes to a violent end when Carolyn speeds through an intersection and is T-boned by another car. Carolyn and Brad survive the collision unharmed and are taken into custody. That afternoon, Brad gives up the location of Donna Martz's body, and 2 days later, her remains are found. Under hours of questioning, their stories don't match up.
Brad basically admitted that, yes, he was involved. He and Carolyn had committed these acts together.
But the hot seat doesn't intimidate Carolyn, who claims she was there in the name of love.
Carolyn's focus seemed to have been that she was an unwitting non-participant just along for the ride, and that this was all Bradley Martin who did all of these acts, and that she was just an innocent babe.
Carolyn's apparent narcissism is fed in so many different ways. She leaves her children, she gets involved in these horrific crimes, but then at the end, just to trump all of this, she turns on Brad, the guy that she was controlling, and supposedly had this intense relationship with.
Carolyn and Brad are extradited to Pennsylvania for the murder of Guy Goodman. In jail awaiting her court date, Carolyn King gets some unexpected news.
It was discovered that Carolyn was pregnant.
9 months later, Carolyn gives birth in custody to Brad's son. It's the first and last time she will ever see him. Tried separately for the murder of Guy Goodman, Carolyn and Brad are found guilty, and both are sentenced to death. The pair pleads guilty and receives life in prison for the murder of Donna Martz.
The right thing was the implementation of the death sentence. The families of Guy Goodman and Donna Martz now at least have a final chapter.
Post-conviction, the one-time lovers display noticeably different behavior.
When Bradley Martin was sentenced, there was indications that he did feel remorse for what had happened.
Carolyn expressed no remorse about any of the activities. Her focus seemed to have been that she was an unwitting non-participant.
She walked out of her marriage, she walked away from her kids, looking for adventure in her life, and boy, did she find it.
Many people might think that there was a drastic change from working an honest job to going on a killing spree, that people don't operate in a vacuum. This woman was a ticking time bomb, indicative of someone who was mentally unstable for quite some time, and we saw the consequences of that.
The human mind has an extraordinary, almost terrifying capacity to lock away a secret, to bury a scream so deep that decades of normal life can grow right over the top of it like thick, deceptive weeds. Imagine waking up every single morning for 20 long years, looking at your face in the bathroom mirror, and knowing that just beneath the surface of your ordinary routine lies the key to a nightmare that paralyzed a whole state back in 2006. It is a chilling reality that became an absolute fact this morning when the heavy iron doors of a decades-old mystery were violently kicked off their hinges by a single, completely unexpected voice. We're talking about the kind of bone-deep, suffocating silence that defines a classic cold case, a dark void where investigative leads go to die, where families break apart under the weight of unceasing grief, and where the community slowly learns to stop asking questions because the answers are simply too terrifying to contemplate. For 2 whole decades, the disappearance of a young student on a rain-slicked November night was treated as an impenetrable enigma, a flawless crime executed by a phantom who left absolutely no physical footprint, no digital trail, and no witnesses. The file sat on the bottom shelf of the county precinct, a thick block of yellowing paper and dead-end transcripts that served as a daily, mocking reminder of the limits of police work. But justice possesses an erratic, unpredictable clock, and today, that clock struck with the force of a lightning bolt. A phone call received in the dead of night didn't just provide a new lead. It tore up the entire established narrative of the crime, exposing a web of collusion, terror, and brilliant deception that had kept a killer safe in the middle of the very people he had traumatized. The flashing lights of tactical units didn't descend on some remote, abandoned cabin or a shadowy underworld hideout. They swarmed a quiet, upper-class suburban street, pinning a highly respected member of the local establishment against his own manicured lawn. This is the sudden, jarring intersection where the long-buried past crashes into a totally unprepared present, a cinematic unmasking that has sent shockwaves through the region and forced an entire town to confront the terrifying truth that the monster they feared was never hiding in the woods. He was sitting next to them at the dinner table. The atmosphere of 2006 was a specific kind of transition, a world caught between the lingering simplicity of the analog era and the total connectivity of the digital age, a loophole in time that a calculated predator knew exactly how to exploit. She was 21, a brilliant biochemistry major with a future so sharp and defined it seemed written in the stars, a young woman whose laugh could cut right through the bleakest, grayest autumn afternoon. The last confirmed sighting of her was at a campus library kiosk at exactly 9:15 p.m., her dark winter coat contrasting sharply with the bright fluorescent glare of the security monitors as she stepped out into a sudden, blinding torrential downpour. She had a 10-minute walk to her off-campus apartment along a path lined with ancient oak trees and flickering, old-fashioned street lamps, a route she had taken 100 times without a single thought of danger. She never arrived, and the world she left behind instantly dissolved into absolute chaos. The initial search was a massive, frantic deployment of community willpower, with hundreds of volunteers marching shoulder to shoulder through muddy ravines, drainage ditches, and swollen creeks, their flashlights cutting erratic beams through the thick Pacific Northwest fog. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. A high-stakes dragnet that involved state troopers, canine units that lost the scent at the edge of the campus perimeter, and a relentless round-the-clock interrogation of classmates, ex-boyfriends, and local transients. Yet, despite the intensity of the effort, the case immediately began to solidify into a terrifying void. There was no abandoned vehicle, no scattered personal belongings, no signs of a struggle on the muddy path, absolutely nothing but the crushing, suffocating weight of her absence. It was as if the rain had not just washed away the physical tracks, but had completely dissolved her from the face of the earth, leaving the detectives to stare at a blank canvas that refused to surrender a single hint. The shock rippled through the student body like an electrical current, transforming a vibrant, open campus into a fortress of paranoia where doors were bolted early, blue light emergency phones were monitored with desperate intensity, and no one walked alone after dusk. The trauma became a permanent fixture of the town's landscape, a cultural dividing line between the safety of the past and the permanent vulnerability of the future, an open, unhealed wound that refused to scab over because the lack of closure kept the infection active. Then, decades later, when the names of the original investigators had been carved onto retirement plaques and the victim's childhood home had been sold twice over, the fragile shell of the killer's safety was punctured by the most volatile element in criminal history, human conscience. The breakthrough didn't originate from a cold case detective digging through a storage locker or a lucky DNA match in a state database. It came from an old emergency room intake log that had been misfiled under a completely different name for 20 years. A low-level administrative clerk, performing a routine digital migration of legacy medical records, noticed a strange discrepancy, an admission record from the exact night of the 2006 disappearance that detailed a patient brought in with severe, defensive lacerations and extreme emotional shock, a patient who had checked out against medical advice within 30 minutes of arrival. When detectives traced that identity, they didn't find a hardened criminal. They found a shell of a person, an individual who had spent the last 2 decades moving from city to city, living under a series of aliases, consumed by an all-consuming terror that had completely destroyed their health. When the interrogation doors closed behind this individual, the dam didn't just leak. It broke completely, unleashing a torrent of truth that turned the entire history of the cold case inside out. This was the unexpected witness, a person who had been trapped in the vehicle that fateful night, a terrified passenger who had been forced to watch the mechanics of an abduction from the passenger seat, silenced for 20 years by a campaign of psychological terror and physical threats that had kept them running across the country in a state of perpetual panic. To listen to the audio playback of that interview is to hear the sound of 20 years of pure, unadulterated fear being dragged into the light, a trembling, gasping narrative that provided the precise coordinates, the exact timeline, and the horrific details of the attack that only the killer and a witness could possibly know. The realization that the answers had been walking the streets, breathing the air, and carrying the horror in their chest for 2 decades sent a collective shiver through the entire department, shifting the investigation from a passive, historical research project into a high-priority, active hunting operation. The suspect's profile was the ultimate insult to the town's collective intelligence, a textbook demonstration of how an absolute monster can construct a brilliant, multi-layered shield of respectability that renders him invisible to the untrained eye. He was a prominent local business owner, a man whose financial contributions built the youth athletic fields, whose face graced the charity galas, and whose political connections reached all the way to the state capitol. He was the guy everyone called when they needed a favor, a family man with a spotless record, a pillar of the community who had actually stood on the courthouse steps during the 2006 vigils, pretending to comfort the student body while the weight of his crime was fresh in his mind. The sheer, chilling narcissism required to maintain that dual existence for 20 years is something that left even the most seasoned behavioral profile specialists in a state of disbelief. He had weaponized his social status, using his wealth and his stellar reputation as an unassailable fortress, knowing that the police would never think to look at the man donating thousands of dollars to their pension funds. When the tactical teams finally moved into position around his sprawling estate, they did so under the absolute cover of darkness, utilizing silent deployments and secure communication channels to ensure that his deep-field network of informants couldn't tip him off. The moment of the takedown was a clinical execution of tactical superiority, the heavy wooden front door breached with a single, deafening impact, the sterile glare of tactical flashlights illuminating a hallway lined with expensive art, and the suspect, caught in a silk bathrobe, brought down to the floor without a single shot being fired. The look in his eyes as the steel cuffs clicked around his wrists wasn't terror. It was a cold, arrogant flash of pure irritation, The reaction of a man who believed his social standing made him inherently superior to the law, a predator who truly thought he had purchased a lifetime of immunity with his philanthropy. The forensic excavation of his property turned the beautiful, manicured estate into a horrific, active crime scene that drew thousands of onlookers to the perimeter fences, their faces pale with a mix of morbid curiosity and profound, nauseating shock. Beneath the floorboards of a detached garden cottage, a space he used as a private home office, the recovery teams uncovered a hidden, concrete-reinforced vault that required heavy industrial equipment to breach. Inside that subterranean space, the air was cold, dry, and heavy with the smell of old paper and chemical preservatives. It wasn't a room, it was a meticulous, highly organized library of trophies, a physical monument to his own depravity. They found personal items belonging to the victim, her college identification card, the silver ring her parents had given her for her 16th birthday, and the dark winter coat, perfectly preserved in a vacuum-sealed garment bag. But the most devastating discovery was a collection of high-resolution photographs taken in the dark, documenting the stalking phase of the crime, images that proved he had been watching her for months, tracking her schedule, mapping her vulnerabilities, and waiting for the perfect convergence of weather and isolation to strike. The details that emerged from the forensic analysis of that vault transformed the 2006 case from an act of random, opportunistic violence into a chilling chronicle of calculated hunting, proving that the suspect had used his wealth to build a private sanctuary where he could hoard the remains of the life he had violently extinguished. The community watched the black evidence bags being carried out of the house in a state of absolute, paralyzed silence, the realization setting in that the ultimate evil hadn't just been living among them, it had been hosting their block parties, shaking their hands, and funding their schools, a terrifying revelation that shattered the very definition of safety within the town. The interrogation room became the final arena for a high-stakes psychological war, a battle of wits between a team of elite state investigators and a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of the unblinking lie. He didn't crumble under the weight of the evidence. He didn't weep, and he didn't invoke his right to silence with the panic of a common criminal. He sat in the metal chair with his legs crossed, his posture elegant, his voice a smooth, patronizing baritone as he dismissed the unexpected witness's testimony as the drug-induced delusions of a broken person. But the detectives were no longer operating in the dark. They had the journals, they had the trophies from the vault, and they had the precise, unassailable timeline provided by the medical records and the witness's statement. They systematically stripped away his defenses, layer by layer, presenting the forensic data not as a question, but as a mathematical certainty that left him zero room to maneuver. The exact moment his composure broke was a sight the lead investigator would later describe as unforgettable, the subtle, terrifying shift when the polite, philanthropic businessman vanished completely and the raw, cold, and predatory intellect of the true killer emerged from behind the eyes. He didn't confess out of remorse. He began to talk because his immense, unchecked narcissism demanded that they understand the brilliance of his design, describing the night of 2006 not as a crime, but as a flawless execution of power, a moment where he had decided that his desire was the only law that mattered in that dark corridor. The legal proceedings that followed were a media circus that turned the county courthouse into the center of the national news cycle, a sprawling public theater where the collective trauma of 20 years was laid bare for the world to see. Every seat in the gallery was claimed hours before dawn, with students, residents, and journalists packed tightly into the wooden benches, the air thick with a volatile mix of grief, fury, and a desperate hunger for retribution. The prosecution's strategy was a relentless, crushing display of forensic synergy, linking the unexpected witness's testimony directly to the physical evidence recovered from the vault with such precision that it left the defense team entirely paralyzed. The defense tried to attack the credibility of the star witness, painting them as mentally unstable and unreliable due to the passage of time, but that strategy collapsed entirely when the prosecution introduced the medical logs and the physical trophies that corroborated every single detail of the witness's statement. The victim's family, who had spent 20 years trapped in a living purgatory of unanswered questions, sat in the front row like a monument of pure, dignified endurance, their eyes fixed on the back of the suspect's neck, their presence a silent, overwhelming moral force that dominated the entire courtroom. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the town outside went completely silent, a collective holding of the breath that spanned across every home, every business, and every street corner, a community waiting for the final, definitive strike of the gavel that would either validate their 2 decades of suffering or plunge them back into the dark. The delivery of the verdict was a moment of pure, cinematic catharsis that shook the very foundations of the building, a single word that carried the explosive release of 20 years of pent-up agony. When the foreman pronounced the word guilty, a collective, jagged gasp tore through the courtroom, a sound that wasn't a cheer, but a deep, soul-cleansing sob from a family that had finally been allowed to step out of the shadows of the unknown. The judge's sentencing remarks were an uncompromising, blistering condemnation of the suspect's life, stripping away his titles, his honors, and his wealth before condemning him to spend the remainder of his natural life in the absolute, permanent isolation of a maximum security cell without the slightest possibility of parole. He was led away in chains, his expensive suit rumpled, his head finally bowed under the weight of an ironclad certainty that no amount of money or political influence could ever change. As the cell doors clicked shut behind him, the town began the slow, agonizingly complex process of trying to rebuild a sense of communal trust that had been completely vaporized by the revelation of his identity. How do you look at your neighbors? How do you walk down the street? How do you trust the people in positions of authority when you know that the ultimate predator was celebrated as a hero by the very community he was systematically destroying from within? The unexpected witness, whose courage had finally broken the 20-year deadlock, vanished back into the anonymity of a witness protection program, leaving behind a legacy of survival that would be studied by forensic psychologists for generations. Their testimony had been the missing link, the singular piece of human variable that the killer's meticulous planning had failed to account for, a reminder that the perfect crime is a statistical myth that will always succumb to the weight of human conscience. The crime scene tape was eventually cleared from the suburban estate, and the house itself was purchased by a land trust, slated for complete demolition to ensure that the physical structure of his deception would be wiped from the face of the earth. But the scar on the town's collective consciousness remains deep and jagged, a permanent reminder of the fragility of suburban peace and the terrifying reality of the monsters who walk among us in broad daylight, wearing the smiles of our benefactors. The 2006 file is finally closed, the text stamped with the permanent ink of a resolved conviction, but the echoes of that rain-slicked November night will continue to vibrate through the halls of the university and the streets of the town for as long as there are people left to remember the girl who went missing and the 20 years of silence it took to finally bring her home. The landscape of the town has physically shifted now, the old oak trees along the path where she disappeared replaced by bright, high-intensity security lighting and emergency stations that stand as a permanent, functional monument to the tragedy. I took one final drive through the downtown district as the sun was setting, watching the ordinary rhythm of life return to the sidewalks, the students walking in groups, the shop owners turning over their signs, the routine movement of commuters heading home in the twilight. The fear is no longer an abstract, creeping phantom that can be projected onto every stranger. It has been contained, defined, and locked away behind prison bars, leaving behind a community that is undeniably altered, more cautious, and significantly less naive, but finally, truly free to breathe. The long wait for justice was over, but the lesson of the 2006 case will remain embedded in the bedrock of this county forever, that the truth is a relentless, patient hunter that doesn't care about the ticking of a clock, the prestige of a name, or the depth of a grave. It will always find its way to the surface, and when it does, it will demand an absolute, uncompromising accounting. The road out of town stretches into a long, clear horizon, the dark clouds of the autumn storm finally breaking apart to reveal the cold, brilliant starlight of a new era. As the lights of the city fade into a singular, distant glow in my rearview mirror, I feel the immense, heavy privilege of having witnessed the absolute collapse of a 30-year deception and the total, righteous restoration of a stolen name to its proper place in history. The case is done, the narrative is complete, And the nightmare that began in the rain of 2006 has finally met its definitive, permanent end in the blinding light of the law. The silence has been broken, the secrets have been exhumed, and as the engine hums against the empty highway, the only thing left waiting in the dark is the future, a future that belongs, at last, entirely and irrevocably to the living, unburdened by the phantoms of the past. The initial breakthrough with the emergency room intake log shattered the frozen landscape of the 2006 file, acting as a high-velocity catalyst that set the entire police apparatus into a state of intense, hyper-focused motion. It was as if a massive, multi-ton vault door had suddenly been unlocked, revealing a labyrinth of connecting tunnels that investigators had bypassed for 2 decades. The administrative clerk who stumbled upon the misfiled admission form didn't just find a name. She uncovered a critical anomaly, a temporal anchor that aligned perfectly with the precise window of the victim's disappearance. When the digital scan of that 20-year-old, handwritten medical log was brought into the high-intensity workspace of the cold case unit, the atmosphere instantly shifted from academic research to the raw, electrical surge of an active manhunt. The name on the sheet belonged to someone who had never been interviewed, someone whose existence had been completely erased from the initial 2006 canvas, hidden behind a clerical error that had cost 2 decades of agonizing silence. Detectives immediately deployed deep search protocols, utilizing modern data scraping networks to track the digital footprint of this elusive figure across state lines, revealing a chaotic trail of sudden relocations, transient employment, and a complete avoidance of permanent financial structures. This wasn't the behavior of a normal citizen moving for a career change. This was the frantic, erratic movement of a human being fleeing a phantom, a person trying to outrun a memory that was systematically burning through every new life they tried to construct. Within 48 hours, the surveillance team had located the witness living in a cramped, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of an industrial city 300 miles away, surviving under a modified variation of their legal name. They were a shell of a person, a walking monument to long-term psychological destruction, their health completely eroded by a 20-year regimen of hypervigilance and untreatable panic. The strategy for the initial approach was crafted with surgical delicacy, knowing that any heavy-handed tactical display would cause the witness to vanish back into the country's anonymous underbelly. 2 veteran investigators, chosen for their calm demeanor and extensive training in trauma-informed interviewing, made contact not at the apartment, but at a quiet, neutral location, a suburban diner where the ambient noise could mask the intensity of the conversation. When the detectives slid the 2006 photograph of the missing biochemistry student across the laminate table, the response was immediate and devastating. The witness did not gasp or ask questions. They simply stared at the image as their entire body began to physically tremble, a deep, visceral shudder that seemed to come from the very center of their bones. The dam that had held back the truth for 20 years didn't just leak. It dissolved completely right there between the coffee cups, the witness weeping with a hollow, gasping sound that attracted the attention of the entire room, the sound of an agonizing debt finally being paid to the conscience. The subsequent formal recording inside the precinct's secure interview room was a tour de force of narrative terror, a systematic unpacking of a 20-year-old nightmare that turned the established theory of the crime completely upside down. The witness described that rain-slicked November night in 2006 not from the perspective of an observer, but from the terrifyingly close proximity of the passenger seat of a vehicle that had been idling near the campus path. They recounted the sound of the torrential rain hammering against the roof, the rhythmic, hypnotic slap of the windshield wipers, and the sudden, violent arrival of the suspect, a man they had known, trusted, and been entirely dependent upon for their livelihood at the time. The witness's voice on the tape is a chilling artifact, cracking with the raw, unfiltered terror of that 20-year-old moment as they described how the suspect had suddenly forced the young student into the back of the vehicle, his movements calculated, silent, and executed with a monstrous, unhurried precision. The narrative detailed a frantic, high-speed drive away from the campus perimeter, the victim crying out in the darkness of the back seat while the suspect maintained a terrifying, icy silence, his hands steady on the steering wheel as if he were simply navigating a routine delivery route. The witness, paralyzed by shock and a sudden, overwhelming realization of their own mortal peril, had tried to intervene, only to be met with a physical assault that left them with the defensive lacerations recorded in the medical log later that night. The suspect had leaned over, his face a mask of absolute, unblinking malice, and delivered a specific, detailed threat. If a single word left their mouth, not only would they be buried next to the girl, but their entire family would be systematically hunted down and erased from existence. It was a masterclass in psychological terror, a threat so potent and so backed by the suspect's vast financial and social resources that it successfully bought 20 years of absolute compliance from a terrified teenager. As the interview progressed into the early hours of the morning, the witness provided the critical piece of information that had eluded the department for 2 decades: the location of the drop point, a remote, historical parcel of land owned by the suspect's family that had never been searched during the initial 2006 sweep. They described the exact route taken through the winding timber roads, the way the headlights cut through the thick fog, and the precise spot where the vehicle had stopped near an old, abandoned stone foundation hidden deep within the old-growth pine forest. This wasn't a vague recollection. It was an image burned into the witnesses' retinas by the white-hot iron of trauma, a memory so clear they could describe the smell of the damp pine needles, the exact angle of the trees, and the terrifying sound of the trunk opening in the dark. The detectives sat in absolute silence, their pens still, knowing they were listening to the definitive roadmap to a burial site that had remained undisturbed while the world changed completely around it. The immediate reaction within the command structure of the state police was a mixture of profound validation and intense, logistical urgency, as the machinery of a massive forensic search operation was mobilized under a strict veil of total secrecy. Investigators knew that the suspect, given his deep ties to local government and law enforcement circles, would likely have early warning systems in place, meaning any leak could result in the immediate destruction of evidence or the flight of the target. A secure command post was established at a secondary precinct 20 miles away from the town, with all communication routed through encrypted channels and all paperwork classified under highest security codes to prevent any internal exposure. The Forensic Archaeology Unit, along with specialized ground-penetrating radar teams and canine handlers trained in historical recovery, were moved into position under the cover of a routine training exercise, their vehicles arriving at the forest perimeter just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The march into the forest clearing was a somber, highly disciplined procession, with dozens of officers moving shoulder to shoulder through the dense undergrowth, their eyes fixed on the ground as they followed the precise coordinates extracted from the witness's statement. The landscape had changed over 20 years. Trees had fallen, new growth had claimed the pathways, and the stone foundation described by the witness was now completely swallowed by thick carpets of moss and wild blackberry brambles. But beneath the natural camouflage lay the unyielding geometry of the suspect's design, and when the radar teams completed their first sweep of the soil adjacent to the stone wall, the monitor displayed a distinct, anomalous variance in the Earth's density, a clear indication of a subsurface disturbance that matched the exact dimensions of a shallow grave. The technical director of the recovery team raised a single hand, signaling an immediate halt to all movement across the site, the silence of the forest turning heavy and suffocating as the realization set in that they were standing on top of the truth. The excavation process was a masterclass in forensic precision, a slow, agonizingly meticulous removal of the earth, layer by layer, with trowels and brushes, ensuring that not a single microscopic piece of evidence was displaced or contaminated by the recovery team. As the topsoil was peeled away, revealing the darker, compacted layers of earth beneath, the recovery dogs began to alert with a quiet, intense focus, their handlers pulling them back to allow the archaeologists to continue their delicate work. 2 feet down, the brushes hit something that didn't belong to the natural geology of the forest, a fragment of dark, synthetic fabric, its fibers perfectly preserved by the unique acidity of the pine soil, its color matching the exact description of the winter coat worn by the biochemistry major on the night she vanished. The atmosphere in the clearing transformed instantly into a field of pure, reverent focus. every officer present removing their hats as the physical remnants of a stolen life began to emerge from the darkness of the ground. The recovery of the remains provided immediate, undeniable proof of the violence that had been visited upon the victim, with the skeletal structure showing clear signs of perimortem trauma that completely obliterated any lingering defense theory of an accidental death or a voluntary disappearance. Forensic anthropologists, working directly inside the excavation pit, identified specific fractures that indicated a severe struggle, proving that the victim had fought with every ounce of her strength against her captor until the very end. The recovery team also located several personal items that had been buried alongside her: a broken watch frozen forever at 10:42 p.m., a textbook on molecular biology, and a small, silver key set that matched the lock on her off-campus apartment door. These weren't just pieces of evidence. They were the heartbreaking artifacts of a routine student life that had been violently intercepted, frozen in time for 20 years beneath the forest floor while the man responsible lived a life of unearned luxury and respect. The transportation of the remains from the forest clearing to the state medical examiner's high-security lab was conducted with the solemnity of a state funeral, a convoy of unmarked vehicles moving through the early morning fog with their lights flashing but their sirens silent. Back at the precinct, the investigative team began the high-stakes process of constructing the arrest warrant, utilizing the newly recovered physical evidence and the comprehensive witness statement to create an unassailable legal document that could withstand the immediate scrutiny of the suspect's expensive legal network. They knew that the moment the handcuffs clicked, a multi-million-dollar defense machine would be activated, meaning every semicolon, every date, and every forensic cross-reference in the warrant had to be flawless. The team worked for 18 straight hours without a break, their desks covered in crime scene photographs, medical logs, and historical property records, driven by a collective determination to ensure that the suspect would find absolutely no legal loopholes to slide through. The property records provided a secondary, equally disturbing line of investigation, revealing that the suspect had purchased the specific parcel of forest land just 3 months before the 2006 abduction, using a shell corporation to obscure his ownership of the site. This wasn't an opportunistic disposal of a body. This was a pre-planned, calculated acquisition of a private dumping ground, a geographic asset selected for its extreme isolation and its proximity to his routine travel corridors. Further analysis of his financial records from that era showed a sudden, unexplained cash withdrawal of $10,000 on the morning after the crime, a sum that investigators now believed was used to fund the initial flight of the witness and secure their initial silence through financial coercion before the psychological terror took full hold. Every document peeled back a new layer of the suspect's sociopathic design, showing a man who didn't just commit a murder, but masterfully engineered an entire system of deception to protect his social standing at all costs. As the clock ticked toward the scheduled execution of the arrest warrant, the tactical entry teams underwent a series of intense, highly detailed briefings, studying the architectural blueprints of the suspect's suburban mansion and mapping every potential exit point. The suspect was known to possess a collection of licensed firearms, meaning the approach had to be executed with an overwhelming display of speed and tactical surprise to prevent the situation from deteriorating into a violent standoff. 3 separate units were deployed: a containment team to secure the perimeter of the wealthy neighborhood, an entry team equipped with breaching gear, and a specialized digital evidence recovery unit tasked with immediately seizing all computers, servers, and storage media before the suspect could initiate any remote data wipe protocols. The energy in the briefing room was thick with adrenaline and a deep, historical gravity. Many of these tactical officers had grown up in the area during the height of the 2006 panic, and they understood exactly what this arrest meant to the soul of their community. The deployment began at precisely 4 a.m., the caravan of black tactical SUVs moving through the quiet, affluent streets of the suburb like a phantom fleet, their engines humming low against the manicured lawns and sleeping houses. The neighborhood was the epitome of security, a gated enclave designed to keep the dangers of the world at bay, yet the ultimate danger was already inside, sleeping soundly behind the double oak doors of house number 14. The containment teams moved with silent fluid precision, blocking the ends of the cul-de-sac and deploying spike strips behind the suspect's luxury vehicles, ensuring that any attempt at a vehicular escape would be stopped instantly. The entry team assembled on the front porch, the flash of a heavy hydraulic breaching tool catching the moonlight for a fraction of a second before it was positioned against the reinforced locking mechanism of the main entrance. The breach was an explosion of sound that shattered the suburban silence like a pane of glass, the massive wooden doors splintering inward with a deafening crack that brought the entire household awake in a state of absolute, paralyzed confusion. State police. Search warrant. Down on the ground. The shouts echoed through the high-ceilinged foyer as the tactical officers swarmed the interior, their weapon-mounted lights cutting through the darkness like lasers. The suspect was intercepted on the second-floor landing, caught in a state of complete vulnerability, his expensive silk pajamas contrasting sharply with the tactical armor and muddy boots of the officers pinning him against the wall. There was no struggle, no dramatic exchange of gunfire. The sheer velocity of the entry had completely bypassed his ability to react, leaving him standing in his own hallway, his hands pulled behind his back as the heavy steel cuffs clicked shut with a sound of absolute finality. The suspect's initial reaction was a chilling display of arrogance, his face twisting into an expression of aristocratic annoyance rather than fear as he looked at the officers occupying his home. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he muttered, his voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of the panic that characterizes a normal arrest scene. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your careers. I want my attorney on the phone immediately." He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed his wealth made him inherently superior to the criminal justice system, a man who had spent 20 years believing that his social status was a permanent, unassailable shield against the consequences of his actions. As he was led down the stairs and out into the crisp morning air, he maintained a rigid, upright posture, refusing to lower his head as the flashbulbs of the media, who had caught wind of the operation, began to illuminate the driveway in a jagged sequence of white light. The search of the mansion began immediately after the suspect was transported, with forensic technicians systematically processing every room, looking for the physical and digital remnants of his 20-year obsession. The home was a monument to success: polished marble floors, expensive art, and photographs of the suspect shaking hands with governors, senators, and community leaders, images that now looked deeply grotesque in the light of the forest excavation. In the master study, hidden behind a false panel in the built-in mahogany bookshelves, the digital recovery unit located a secure, standalone server rack that was completely disconnected from the home's primary internet network. This was his private digital vault, an encrypted archive that had been maintained with the same clinical precision as his corporate business accounts, a repository of data that investigators suspected contained the true history of his predatory life. The discovery of the standalone server changed the entire scope of the investigation, shifting the focus from a singular cold case into a potential exposure of a long-term, multi-victim operation that had been conducted under the nose of the county for decades. Tech experts immediately began the complex process of bypassing the encryption layers, a digital excavation that was just as delicate and critical as the physical work that had been performed in the forest clearing. Every file recovered, every hidden folder opened, was a potential page in a ledger of secrets that the suspect had believed would remain buried forever behind his walls. The precinct was a hive of intense, nonstop activity through the day, with detectives from various regional divisions arriving to cross-reference their own unresolved files against the newly discovered data, the realization setting in that the arrest of this single pillar of the community could be the key to unlocking a generation of unsolved trauma. As the sun began to set on the day of the arrest, the town outside was caught in a state of profound, collective shock, the news of the businessman's involvement moving through the streets with the destructive force of a natural disaster. People gathered on street corners, in local diners, and outside the courthouse steps, staring at their phones as the details of the forest excavation and the identity of the suspect were confirmed by official press releases. The realization that they had celebrated this man, that they had taken his money, that they had allowed him to stand near their children at community events, was a psychological violation that left the entire population feeling physically nauseated. The narrative of their town's history had been violently rewritten in the span of 12 hours, transforming their quiet, safe haven into a landscape where the ultimate evil had been allowed to wear the mask of their primary benefactor for 20 long years. The long wait for justice was entering its final, legal phase, but the shadow cast by the 2006 disappearance had changed its shape entirely, transforming from a vague phantom into a concrete, undeniable monster that was now locked inside a state cell. The detectives who had spent decades chasing the ghost were left with a heavy, exhausting sense of duty fulfilled, their eyes red from lack of sleep, but their resolve harder than ever as they prepared for the upcoming courtroom battle. They knew that the arrest was just the beginning of the end, and that the true reckoning would take place in the blinding light of the trial, where every secret would be exhumed and every lie would be permanently crushed by the weight of the truth. The long, dark night that began in the rain of 2006 was finally drawing to a close, and the dawn that was coming promised to be a cold, hard, and entirely unforgiving revelation for the man who thought he had committed the perfect crime. The structural integrity of the suspect's 40-year fortress of lies did not merely crack during the third phase of the judicial proceedings. It collapsed inward with a catastrophic momentum that permanently rearranged the psychological landscape of the entire county. The courtroom, an austere chamber of high-back walnut benches and dull, rhythmic fluorescent lighting, was transformed from a site of formal legal theater into a clinical laboratory where a monster was methodically dissected in front of a breathless gallery. The prosecution, spearheaded by a legal team that moved with the absolute, unblinking synergy of a high-velocity machine, began the systematic introduction of the evidence recovered from the standalone server rack found hidden behind the false bookshelf panel. This was the moment the community fully realized they were not dealing with an ordinary criminal who had succumbed to a singular, fleeting burst of animal impulse, but an analytical, highly sophisticated predator who had treated the entire region as a private hunting preserve while using his immense wealth to buy absolute invisibility. The digital forensic specialists took the stand first, their voices calm, technical, and entirely devoid of emotional inflection as they began to display the contents of the unencrypted file directories onto the massive projection screens facing the jury. The files were organized with the exact same corporate metadata structures the suspect used to manage his multi-million-dollar logistics firm, a detail that made the blood run cold throughout the room. There were folders labeled with precise dates, geographical coordinates, and meteorological data, proving that the suspect had tracked the victim's daily routine with the patience of an apex hunter preparing for an execution. The screen displayed tracking maps, digital breadcrumbs showing that on 14 separate occasions in the months leading up to that rain-slicked November night in 2006, the suspect's personal vehicle had been idling within a 3-block radius of the biochemistry department's laboratory kiosk at the exact time the victim was scheduled to exit. To see those tracking maps overlaid with the timeline of a young woman's ordinary, ambitious life created a suffocating atmosphere in the gallery that made it physically difficult to draw a full breath. The jurors sat motionless, their eyes darting between the digital maps and the defendant, who remained seated at the defense table in a state of rigid, clinical detachment, his posture upright, his chin elevated, his face still maintaining the practiced arrogance of a man who believed his social prestige placed him entirely outside the reach of common morality. But the prosecution was no longer merely arguing a theory. They were laying out a mathematical equation of guilt that left zero margin for error or defense-led obstruction. Every coordinate matched a cellular tower ping. Every timestamp aligned perfectly with the surveillance footage that had been pulled from campus security archives and enhanced using modern digital restoration techniques that didn't exist when the file first went cold. The emotional center of gravity in the room shifted violently when the prosecution introduced the audio recordings extracted from the server's deepest, multi-layered encryption sectors. These were the audio journals, vocal logs the suspect had recorded using a high-end dictation device in the quiet hours of his luxury study, treating his memories of the crime as a collection of high-value assets to be reviewed and savored whenever the mundanity of his public life grew tedious. When the prosecutor pressed the playback button, the suspect's voice, a smooth, authoritative, and deeply familiar baritone that had graced local charity galas and radio advertisements for 20 years, filled the courtroom, discussing the mechanics of the 2006 abduction with the cold, unfeeling detachment of a surgeon describing a routine appendectomy. He referred to the victim not by her name, but as the target of opportunity, describing how the extreme weather conditions of that November night had provided the perfect acoustic and visual camouflage for his entry into the campus perimeter. The sound of that voice, echoing off the wooden walls of the chamber, caused several members of the gallery to weep openly, while others stared at the floor in a state of absolute, paralyzed revulsion. The suspect's own defense team looked as if they had been physically struck, their eyes fixed on their legal pads, their pen static as the voice of their client dismantled their remaining strategies in a matter of minutes. The recording detailed the precise moment of the interception on the oak-lined path, the suspect describing the victim's initial confusion, her immediate attempt to resist, and the absolute ease with which he had neutralized her defense using a chemical restraint he had obtained through his corporate supply chains. It was a narrative of absolute domination, an unvarnished window into a sociopathic intellect that had completely uncoupled itself from the human spectrum of empathy, replacing it with a grotesque, narcissistic worship of his own absolute power over life and death. Sitting in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table, the victim's family remained a monument of pure, unyielding human dignity, their bodies pressed together like a fortress against the onslaught of the graphic details. For 20 years, they had been forced to live in a vacuum of information, their minds creating 1,000 separate, terrifying scenarios of what might have happened to their daughter in the dark. Now, the vacuum was being filled with the hard, crystalline truth, and while the reality was a nightmare of immense proportions, the look on their faces was not one of defeat. It was the look of a family that was finally witnessing the destruction of the phantom that had haunted their dreams for a generation. They watched the back of the suspect's neck with a searing, uninterrupted intensity, their presence a silent, crushing moral force that seemed to dominate the entire room, forcing everyone present to remember that beneath the digital files and the legal arguments lay the stolen life of a brilliant 21-year-old girl. The defense attorney, a seasoned veteran who had earned millions defending the region's elite against complex criminal indictments, stood to conduct his cross-examination of the digital forensic unit, but his voice lacked its characteristic fire, sounding thin, brittle, and entirely performative. He tried to suggest that the server could have been accessed remotely, that the files could have been planted by a corporate rival or a malicious entity seeking to destroy the suspect's business empire, but the prosecution's infrastructure was too massive and too well-engineered to be disrupted by such standard legal maneuvers. The tech expert simply pulled up the hardware logs, showing that the standalone server had zero network connectivity capabilities, meaning every single byte of data had been transferred physically via a direct hardware connection within the suspect's private office, authenticated by a biometric security sequence that matched the defendant's right thumbprint. The defense attorney sat down without a follow-up question, the realization setting in across the room that the trial had transitioned from a battle of narratives into a formal execution of the law. As the afternoon session commenced, the prosecution introduced the unexpected witness back into the narrative, not by bringing them physically into the high-risk environment of the courtroom, but via a secure, high-definition closed-circuit video link from an undisclosed federal location. The witness's face was partially obscured to protect their identity within the witness protection framework, but their voice came through the speakers with a raw, trembling clarity that captivated every individual in the room. They walked the jury through the geography of the suspect's family timberland, matching their 20-year-old memory perfectly with the aerial drone footage and forensic maps that the police had generated during the recent excavation of the burial site. The witness described the exact configuration of the old stone foundation, the specific way the trees bent toward the northern ridge, and the terrifying, metallic sound of the suspect shoveling the wet earth in the beam of the vehicle's high beams while they sat paralyzed by terror in the passenger seat. The cross-examination of the witness was the defense's last stand, a desperate, aggressive attempt to paint them as an unreliable narrator whose memory had been corrupted by 20 years of severe psychological instability and substance abuse. The defense attorney leaned heavily into the witness's medical history, reading from old psychiatric logs and treatment records to suggest that the entire story was a product of a fractured mind looking for a scapegoat to explain their own life's difficulties. But the witness did not break. Instead, the pressure seemed to crystallize their focus, their voice dropping an octave as they looked directly into the camera lens and addressed the defense table. "I spent 20 years running from that night," the witness whispered, the sound of their voice silencing the entire room. "I changed my name, I ruined my health, and I destroyed my life because I was terrified of what that man would do to me if I spoke the truth. You can call me crazy, you can call me a liar, but those bones in the dirt don't lie. He did it. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he enjoyed every single second of it." The impact of that statement was immediate and definitive, acting as a terminal blow to the defense's attempt to mitigate the severity of the charges. The jury members were no longer taking notes. They were simply staring at the suspect with an expression of cold, unadulterated condemnation. The judge, an individual whose 30 years on the bench had made him an immovable anchor of legal discipline, denied every subsequent motion for a mistrip or a suspension of the proceedings, keeping the momentum of the trial moving forward like a steamroller. Outside the courthouse walls, the city was caught in a state of suspended animation, with local news channels broadcasting live updates every 15 minutes, turning the lawn of the judicial building into a forest of satellite dishes and microphone stands. The community was no longer arguing about the probabilities of the case. They were preparing themselves for the final, inevitable delivery of a verdict that would formally close the darkest chapter in their modern history. I spent the evening hours walking the perimeter of the university campus, retracing the exact path the victim had taken from the library kiosk to the oak-lined corridor where her life was intercepted. The air was sharp, biting with the scent of an incoming winter frost, and the modern security lamps that now lined the walkway cast a bright, clinical white glare across the pavement, a stark contrast to the dim, flickering amber illumination that had defined the landscape in 2006. I saw groups of students moving between the buildings, their conversations light, their movements free, entirely unburdened by the ancient terror that had dictated the lives of their predecessors 20 years ago. The realization hit me with a profound, quiet weight. This safety, this normalcy, was the true harvest of the investigation. The trial in the courthouse wasn't just about punishing a monster. It was about reclaiming the physical and psychological geography of the town from the shadow of an unresolved horror, restoring the right of the living to exist without fear in the spaces where a tragedy had occurred. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to absolute capacity hours before the judge took the bench, the air inside thick with the collective adrenaline of a population that had arrived to witness the final, definitive stroke of the legal axe. The prosecution delivered its closing arguments not with the theatrical rhetoric of a movie performance, but with the chilling, structural efficiency of an architect delivering the final structural report on a doomed building. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury box, her hands empty, her voice steady, resonant, and entirely unhurried as she summarized the convergence of the digital logs, the audio journals, the witness testimony, and the physical artifacts pulled from the depths of the forest grave. "The defense wants you to believe that this is a case of shadows and coincidences," she stated, her eyes locking with each juror in sequence. "But science does not deal in shadows. The DNA belongs to her. The voice on the recording belongs to him. The secret server belongs to him. For 20 years, this man used his wealth to buy a life of luxury while the victim was left in the cold silence of the woods. The clock has finally run out on his lie. It is time to bring her home, and it is time to put him in the dark where he belongs." The jury deliberation was an absolute formality, a brief, 45-minute window of time that served only as the necessary legal bridge to the final destination of the case. When the buzzer sounded, signaling that a verdict had been reached, a physical shudder ran through the entire gallery, a collective intake of breath that seemed to lower the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. The suspect stood as the jury filed back into the box, his face still maintaining that rigid, aristocratic mask, but for the first time since the breach of his home, a subtle tremor was visible in his right jawline. the first physical indication that the reality of his total downfall was finally penetrating his defensive narcissism. The court clerk took the verdict slip from the foreman's hands, her fingers steady as she began to read the text into the permanent record of the state. The pronunciation of the word guilty on the charge of first-degree murder was not met with cheers or outbursts from the gallery. Instead, it was greeted by a sound that was far more powerful, a deep, collective, and soul-cleansing sob that erupted from the victim's family, a sound that carried the explosive release of 20 years of pent-up agony, broken sleep, and corrosive uncertainty. The suspect did not move, he did not look back, and he did not speak as the judge proceeded immediately to the sentencing phase, bypasses the traditional delays to deliver a blistering, uncompromising condemnation of the defendant's entire existence. "You are a predator who wore the skin of a citizen," the judge stated, his voice ringing through the silent room like a bell of absolute judgment. "You used your status to protect yourself from the consequences of a monstrous act, but you forgot that the truth does not care about your money or your name. I sentence you to life in prison without the slightest possibility of parole. You will die in a cage, anonymous, powerless, and completely forgotten by the world you sought to dominate." As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists for the final time, the bailiff stepped in, pulling the suspect toward the secure holding cell door behind the bench. He was no longer the prominent business owner, no longer the philanthropist, and no longer the architect of secrets. He was a convicted murderer, a non-person whose name would eventually be erased from the local landscape, his corporate empire slated for liquidation to pay the massive civil judgments that would follow. The door closed behind him with a dull, heavy thud that signaled the definitive, permanent end of his 60-year run of unearned freedom, a sound that marked the formal closing of the 2006 file and the total, righteous restoration of balance to the soul of the community. The exodus from the courthouse was a slow, dazed, and deeply reflective process, with people stepping out into the blinding winter sunlight like survivors emerging from an underground bunker after a multi-year war. The media vans were already beginning to pack up their cables, their cameras turning away from the building to look for the next sensational headline in some other distant town, leaving the local residents with the quiet, monumental reality of their own history. The detectives who had inherited the case stood on the steps, their faces lined with an exhaustion that transcended the normal limits of the job, but their eyes were clear, their shoulders square, their duty finally and absolutely discharged. They had entered the darkness, they had fought the phantoms, and they had come out the other side with the truth in their hands, delivering the only ending that the biochemistry student had ever deserved. The 2006 case is finally history, its documents tucked away in the deep archives of the judicial system, its status marked with the permanent ink of a resolved conviction, but the lessons of the tragedy remain embedded in the very bedrock of the county's identity. The town has learned that the ultimate danger does not always wear the face of a stranger in the dark. It can wear the smile of our primary benefactor, hiding behind the very structures we build to protect ourselves. But they have also learned that justice is not an abstract concept that fades with the passage of time. It is a relentless, patient hunter that will wait 40 years, 50 years, or a lifetime to collect its debt, driven forward by the unyielding persistence of those who refuse to let a name be forgotten in the dark. The silence has been broken, the nightmare is over, and as the winter wind blows through the quiet streets of the city, the future belongs, at last, entirely and irrevocably to the living, unburdened by the ghosts of the past, free to walk into the light of an honest tomorrow. The transition from the grand, shattering climax of the verdict into the cold, technical reality of its forensic aftermath was not a sudden break, but a deep, structural shift in the very atmosphere of the state precinct. The trial had concluded, the word guilty had been written into the permanent ledger of the state, but the physical remnants of the suspect's 20-year deception were still being unpacked inside the high-security processing bays of the state crime lab. This was the silent, gritty reality that the public never saw on the television news updates, the methodical, exhausting cataloging of thousands of items that had been extracted from the suburban mansion's secret standalone server, and the deep recesses of the family's Timberland plot. For the investigative team, there was no immediate celebration. No triumphant return to normal routines. There was only the heavy, continuous burden of ensuring that every single thread of this massive, historical case was tied down with absolute legal finality. The file folders on the primary desk were thick, their corners frayed by 20 years of continuous handling, but they were now being stamped with a bold, red, and entirely permanent marker. Resolved. Inside the forensic facility, the digital recovery unit continued to pull data from the standalone server rack, uncovering a terrifyingly vast archive of surveillance files that extended far beyond the specific tracking of the biochemistry student in 2006. The analysts sat under the steady hum of industrial air filtration systems, their eyes fixed on high-resolution monitors as they watched the true scope of a predator's life work reveal itself frame by frame, document by document. They discovered that the suspect had systematically utilized his logistics company's fleet management software to create private, encrypted overlays that tracked the movements of dozens of young women across 3 different university campuses over a span of 15 years. It was a digital map of absolute stalking, a cold, calculated operation where transit times, class schedules, and local weather patterns were cross-referenced to find the exact moments of maximum vulnerability. The realization that the 2006 case was not an isolated anomaly, but the horrific apex of a highly organized, long-term campaign of targeted surveillance sent an immediate shudder through the entire department, forcing investigators to look at their own open files with a sudden, urgent sense of dread. The tracking data pulled from the server showed that the suspect possessed an almost supernatural level of patience, sometimes monitoring a specific individual for 6 to 8 months without ever making an overt move, simply cataloging her habits, her social circles, and her preferred routes home in the dark. He had weaponized the very concept of routine, turning the predictable nature of a student's academic life into the primary vulnerability he could exploit. The digital specialists mapped these historical tracking coordinates against old missing person reports from surrounding counties, their faces turning increasingly pale as the geographical pings began to align with several unresolved disappearances from the late 90s and early 2000s. The 2006 cold case had been the key that unlocked the vault, but the vault itself was revealing a landscape of hidden trauma that threatened to overwhelm the local justice system, transforming a singular victory into the opening chapter of a much larger, multi-jurisdictional investigation into a lifetime of calculated violence. While the digital teams excavated the server, the field teams remained deployed at the remote Timberland parcel, expanding the search perimeter around the old stone foundation to ensure that no other secrets were left buried in the dark of the old-growth pine forest. The ground-penetrating radar units moved across the damp, moss-covered earth in a steady, rhythmic grid, their monitors sending back high-resolution anomalies that required immediate, manual verification by the forensic archaeology squad. The work was physically punishing and emotionally draining, carried out in the biting, icy cold of a Pacific Northwest winter, with officers working on their knees with trowels and small hand brushes under the constant, heavy canopy of the silent trees. Every rusted piece of metal, every displaced layer of compacted soil, and every fragment of synthetic material was treated with the highest level of forensic sanctity, processed through an on-site mobile laboratory to determine if it belonged to the natural geology of the timber plot or if it was an artifact of human intervention. The lead detective, a man whose hair had turned completely gray over the course of the 20-year investigation, stood at the edge of the clearing, watching his team work with a look of profound, quiet concentration. He held a copy of the suspect's voice logs in his hand, the transcripts of those chilling, smooth baritone monologues where the killer had detailed the perfection of his geographic selection. The suspect had chosen this specific parcel of land not just for its isolation, but because the unique chemical composition of the pine needle topsoil and the high water table accelerated the decomposition of organic material while preserving synthetic fibers, a detail that demonstrated an advanced, terrifying knowledge of forensic science. He had built his dumping ground with the same analytical care that he used to construct his distribution warehouses, treating the destruction of human life as a logistical challenge to be optimized and insulated from the observation of the law. The transcripts revealed that the suspect would regularly drive past the entrance of the Timber Road on his way to corporate meetings in the state capital, pulling his luxury vehicle over onto the shoulder for a few brief minutes, just to look out at the tree line, savoring the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the moss while the rest of the world looked at him as a pillar of regional industry. This level of unblinking, sustained narcissism was something that left even the most experienced behavioral psychologists in the department in a state of clinical shock. He didn't avoid the sight of his crime. He integrated it into his routine, using the proximity to his victim as a source of private psychological power that fueled his public arrogance for 2 decades. The detective closed the binder, the sound of the paper snapping shut echoing through the quiet forest like a gunshot, a silent vow forming in his chest that no matter how many years it took, every single secret held by this dirt would be dragged into the light of day. Back in the city, the social and economic fallout from the businessman's conviction was systematically dismantling the architecture of the local establishment, tearing through the community with the destructive force of a controlled demolition. His multi-million-dollar logistics firm, which employed hundreds of local residents and funded dozens of community programs, went into immediate, chaotic receivership as banks and investment funds scrambled to sever all ties with a brand that was now permanently synonymous with first-degree murder. The corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass and steel structure that had once been praised as a symbol of the town's modernization, became a ghost town overnight, its offices sealed by federal marshals and its assets frozen to secure the massive financial judgments that were being prepared by the victims' legal representatives. The local boards, the charity committees, and the political action networks that had proudly listed the suspect as a primary benefactor spent their days in emergency sessions, frantically scrubbing his name from their buildings, their letterheads, and their history in a desperate, losing attempt to outrun the taint of his association. The psychological betrayal felt by the ordinary citizens was deep, visceral, and entirely unresolvable. Neighbors who had lived next to his sprawling estate for decades, who had attended his summer pool parties, and who had trusted him to write letters of recommendation for their children's college applications found themselves looking at their own memories through a distorted, terrifying lens. Every polite interaction, every shared joke across the garden fence, and every neighborly gesture was now revealed to be a calculated performance executed by a man who was simultaneously hoarding the clothes and identification cards of a murdered student in a subterranean concrete vault beneath his garage. The realization that their safety had been a total illusion, that the ultimate predator had been protected not by the shadows of an alleyway, but by the very wealth and respectability they admired, fundamentally altered the social contract of the suburb, replacing the easy, trusting confidence of the community with a sharp, permanent skepticism that would dictate their lives for a generation. The unexpected witness, whose sudden breakthrough statement had broken the 20-year deadlock, remained under 48-hour protective custody at a secure, undisclosed military installation, their transition into the Federal Witness Protection Program being managed with absolute tactical secrecy. The state attorneys knew that even from inside a maximum security cell, the suspect's deep field network of financial influence and high-level connections posed a continuous, viable threat to the person who had dismantled his empire. The witness's formal deposition, a massive 500-page document that detailed every interaction, every threat, and every financial transaction forced upon them by the suspect since 2006, was locked inside a dual-key safe at the state capitol, serving as the legal bedrock for the upcoming civil trials and the potential secondary indictments that were being prepared by surrounding counties. To read that document was to understand the true, terrifying velocity of the suspect's power, how a 19-year-old passenger had been systematically tracked, isolated, and psychologically broken until their entire existence became a hollow shell dedicated to maintaining the silence of a killer. The forensic laboratory finished its final, definitive report on the skeletal remains of the biochemistry student late on a Tuesday evening, the documentation matching the precise parameters required to formally close the medical examiner's file. The analysis confirmed that the perimodem trauma to the hyoid bone and the specific fractures along the upper vertebrae were entirely consistent with a high-intensity manual restraint, completely obliterating the defense's initial, desperate suggestions that the victim might have succumbed to an accidental fall or an exposure event in the storm. The watch that had been recovered from the mud, its silver casing pitted by 20 years of soil acidity, its hands rusted into an immovable position at exactly 10:42 p.m., was delivered to the primary investigator in a small, sealed plastic evidence box. It was the physical manifestation of the exact moment a life had been intercepted, a terrifyingly precise timestamp that aligned perfectly with the pings from the suspect's corporate vehicle logs and the unexpected witness's timeline of the drive into the forest. The primary investigator sat at his desk, staring at the small, frozen hands of the watch through the clear plastic, the silence of the empty precinct wrapping around him as the true weight of the conclusion finally settled into his bones. For 20 years, his entire career had been defined by the absence of this girl, his whiteboard covered in names, dates, and question marks that refused to connect into a coherent picture. Now, the board was clean, the questions were replaced by solid, undeniable facts, and the man responsible was sitting in an orange jumpsuit inside a concrete cell, waiting for the transport bus that would take him to the maximum security penitentiary where he would spend the rest of his natural life. There was no joy in the victory, no sense of professional elation. There was only a deep, heavy, and exhausting sense of relief that a long-delayed debt to the truth had finally been paid in full, and that a stolen name had been rightfully restored to its family. The formal release of the victim's remains to her parents took place the following morning at a small, private garage behind the medical examiner's office, away from the lingering glare of the media cameras that still monitored the front entrance of the building. The parents, now elderly individuals whose faces carried the deep, indelible map of 20 years of unceasing grief, stood together as the plain oak casket was loaded into the back of a waiting hearse. They did not speak to the reporters who attempted to breach the perimeter. They simply held onto each other's hands with a strength that defied their physical frailty, their eyes fixed on the wooden box that contained the definitive answer to the question that had consumed half of their adult lives. They were finally leaving the courthouse, finally leaving the precinct, and finally leaving the purgatory of the unknown, taking their daughter back to the quiet family plot in the countryside where she should have been laid to rest 2 decades ago. As the hearse pulled out of the courtyard, its tires crunching softly against the gravel, the primary investigator stood on the steps, raising a single hand in a silent, respectful salute to the family he had served for 20 years. He watched the vehicle disappear into the heavy morning fog that routinely rolled off the river, knowing that while the legal file was closed, the psychological impact of the 1986 disappearance would remain a permanent feature of the town's identity for as long as the old oak trees stood along the campus path. The mystery had been solved, the mechanics of the crime had been laid bare with surgical precision, and the monster had been stripped of his power, but the cost of that truth was a scar that would never fully heal, a cold, hard reminder of how easily the darkness can thrive in the middle of our most respected spaces if we choose to look away from the warning signs. The long, dark night that began in the rain of 2006 had finally met its definitive, permanent dawn, leaving behind a community that was undeniably altered, more cautious, and significantly more aware of the true nature of the world around them. The standalone server was cataloged, the timberland clearing was restored to the quiet custody of the state park system, and the documents were moved to the dead archives building on the edge of the city, their pages destined to gather dust alongside 1,000 other resolved tragedies. But the story itself was now a part of the regional bedrock, a narrative passed down from generation to generation not as a legend of dread, but as a monument to the absolute, unyielding power of human persistence over the cowardice of a lie. The silence had been broken, the secrets had been exhumed, and as the winter sun finally broke through the gray clouds to illuminate the empty streets of the town, the future belonged, at last, entirely and irrevocably to the living, free to move forward into the light of an honest tomorrow, unburdened by the phantoms of the past. The true velocity of the investigation's expansion became fully apparent during the 5th phase of the forensic recovery operation, a period that the local media quickly labeled the subterranean inquest. Now that the suspect had been formally processed and stripped of his immediate legal defenses by the overwhelming weight of the initial DNA match, the state's technical divisions were no longer moving with the caution of a team investigating a singular, isolated disappearance. They had transitioned into a full-scale forensic excavation of the suspect's entire physical and financial history, a process that required the deployment of industrial cutting equipment, deep field ground radar, and structured data mining algorithms inside the corporate headquarters of his defunct logistics firm. The primary objective was no longer just the consolidation of the 2006 case file. It was the total mapping of a multi-decade operational infrastructure that had allowed a highly functional predator to systematically exploit the regional transport networks for his own dark gratification. The focus of the field teams had narrowed significantly onto the concrete-reinforced vault discovered beneath the floorboards of the detached garden cottage on the suspect's estate. Forensic engineers, utilizing high-resolution ultrasonic imaging, discovered that the subterranean space was far more complex than a standard residential safe or an improvised root cellar. The structure had been engineered with an independent, commercial-grade climate control unit, a multi-layer waterproofing membrane, and a secondary electrical circuit that bypassed the home's primary breaker box, a design that ensured the contents would remain perfectly insulated from the elements even in the event of a catastrophic long-term power failure. It was a museum of absolute intent, a space constructed with the deliberate, long-term purpose of preservation, proving to the behavioral analysis teams that the suspect had never viewed his actions as temporary deviations, but as a permanent, high-value career that required structural insulation from the real world. Inside the vault, the air processing units had kept the relative humidity at an absolute, unchanging 40% for 2 decades, a detail that had a profound, unexpected impact on the state of the evidence. When the primary recovery team began the systematic extraction of the physical items, they found themselves handling artifacts that looked as though they had been placed on the stainless steel shelves only hours prior, completely unmarred by the typical decay, mold, or insect activity that routinely degrades evidence in historical cold cases. The silver ring the victim had received for her 16th birthday, recovered from a velvet-lined compartment inside a high-security lockbox, was completely free of tarnish, its engraved inscription still sharp, clear, and perfectly legible under the high-intensity forensic work lights. This level of preservation was a double-edged sword for the defense. It meant that the physical links between the suspect and the victim were not speculative or degraded, but were pristine, high-fidelity matches that possessed the exact same forensic weight as evidence pulled from a fresh crime scene. As the technicians cataloged the items, they uncovered a secondary shelf that contained a series of high-density magnetic data tapes, the kind used by large-scale logistical operations in the early 2000s to back up their corporate shipping manifests and fleet tracking logs. The digital forensics team immediately routed these tapes to the state capitol's specialized media recovery center, utilizing legacy tape drives that had been carefully restored to functional status to extract the raw, uncompressed binary data hidden within the magnetic strips. What emerged from those tapes was a digital ledger of terror that systematically demolished the defense's remaining narrative of a singular lapse in judgment. The data contained automated tracking logs from the suspect's private corporate vehicle from the years 2002 through 2007, showing that his movements during those years were punctuated by highly specific, repetitive geographical anomalies that aligned with the exact dates and times of 6 other unresolved missing person investigations across the Pacific Northwest. The projection screens inside the command center displayed these historical tracking lines as a series of vivid, overlapping red trajectories that cut across the state maps like a spider's web, with the 2006 campus path standing out as merely one node in a much larger, continent-wide hunting network. The suspect had systematically weaponized his position as a logistics coordinator, utilizing his intimate knowledge of commercial delivery routes, blind spots in highway surveillance, and the predictable schedules of long-haul freight corridors to select locations that offered maximum operational security. He was a man who understood the geometry of isolation. He knew exactly how far a vehicle could travel off the main interstate before hitting a zone that was completely unmonitored by law enforcement, and he used that knowledge to construct a phantom transport system that moved right alongside the legal commerce of the region, completely invisible to the local sheriffs who were looking for a common transient. The revelation of the magnetic tape data triggered an immediate, emergency integration of several regional cold case squads, with detectives from 3 neighboring states arriving at the precinct with their own boxes of yellowing files, their faces tight with a mixture of intense professional focus and deep, visceral fury. They sat around the central conference table until the early hours of the morning, cross-referencing the suspect's corporate travel itineraries against old police logs, gas station receipts, and hotel registries from a generation ago. The data matched with a terrifying, mechanical regularity. Every unexplained gap in his business travel schedule, every late-night detour down a rural logging road, and every sudden, unscripted maintenance check on his company's regional warehouses now corresponded to a date when a young woman had vanished from a bus stop, a campus parking lot, or a roadside convenience store. The scale of the discovery began to crush the independent identity of the 2006 case, transforming the narrative from a local tragedy into one of the most extensive, calculated multi-state forensic investigations in modern law enforcement history. The primary investigator, a man who had lived with a biochemistry student's face on his desk for 20 years, found himself facing a completely different kind of exhaustion. The realization that his victory in the 2006 file was just the first domino to fall in a sequence that would require years of continuous, grueling legal and analytical labor to fully resolve. He sat in the dark of his office, the glow from the computer monitor illuminating the sprawling network of connections on his wall, his mind grappling with the terrifying efficiency of the man who had been living just 5 miles away from the precinct, masquerading as a benevolent captain of industry while maintaining a ledger of human destruction that spanned half the country. Outside the law enforcement bubble, the economic liquidation of the suspect's corporate holdings was creating a massive, chaotic vacuum in the local economy, tearing through the community's financial stability like an explosion. The logistics firm's primary distribution hub, a massive 300,000 square foot facility on the industrial edge of the city, was placed under absolute federal receivership, its fleet of delivery trucks grounded, its shipping lanes frozen, and its internal databases seized by federal auditors investigating potential cross-border corporate fraud. Hundreds of local warehouse workers, truck drivers, and administrative staff found themselves locked out of their workplace overnight, their pension funds frozen, their health insurance canceled, and their entire professional history permanently associated with a brand that was now universally reviled as the financial vehicle of a serial offender. The local community leaders who had once competed for the suspect's financial patronage were caught in a public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions, with local activist groups and student organizations demanding an immediate, transparent audit of every dollar the suspect had ever contributed to public infrastructure. The youth athletic complex that bore his name became the site of daily, angry protests, with parents arriving with cans of black spray paint to deface the bronze plaque at the entrance, refusing to allow their children to play on fields that had been funded by the profits of a logistics company that was now revealed to be a mechanism for abduction. The hypocrisy of his public life was the ultimate insult. He had built his reputation on protecting the community, on creating jobs, and on funding safety initiatives, using the very money generated by his corporate success to insulate his private playground of horror from the curiosity of the world. The unexpected witness, whose initial statement had set this entire legal avalanche into motion, was undergoing a grueling, multi-day deposition inside a secure military facility, their words being transcribed by a team of federal court reporters to ensure that every single memory was preserved in an ironclad, legally unassailable format. The witness's narrative was no longer just about the specific mechanics of the 2006 abduction. They were now being asked to re-examine every single interaction they had ever had with the suspect during their employment at the logistics firm, looking for the subtle clues, the strange deviations in routine, and the logistical anomalies that they had dismissed as mere corporate eccentricities 20 years ago. The witness recalled several instances where the suspect had ordered specific delivery vehicles to be detailed and rerouted to his private estate under the cover of night, instructions that now aligned perfectly with the timestamps found on the magnetic data tapes recovered from the subterranean vault. To read the transcripts of these depositions is to witness the slow, agonizing process of a human mind being forced to look back at its own history through a lens of absolute horror, realizing that they had been an unwitting pawn in a massive, calculated system of violence. The witness described how the suspect would routinely monitor the regional news broadcasts inside his corporate office, his face entirely unblinking, his voice calm and professional as he discussed the ongoing police search for the missing biochemistry student with his executive staff, even offering to deploy his company's private security personnel to assist the university's campus watch teams. This level of psychological manipulation was so total that it had completely paralyzed the witness's ability to act, creating a sense of absolute futility that had kept them silent for 20 years, trapped in a cage of fear constructed by a man who seemed to control every facet of the world they lived in. Back at the primary recovery site in the Timberland parcel, the archaeology teams made a secondary discovery late on a Friday afternoon that fundamentally altered the legal strategy of the prosecution team. While clearing a dense section of wild blackberry brambles approximately 50 yards north of the old stone foundation, the ground-penetrating radar recorded a highly localized, high-density metallic anomaly buried 3 feet beneath the roots of an ancient cedar tree. When the excavation team carefully removed the soil, they uncovered a rusted, industrial-grade steel lockbox that had been sealed with a commercial silicone adhesive to prevent water penetration. Inside that box lay a collection of identity cards, driver's licenses, and personal keychains belonging to 4 separate women who had vanished from neighboring states between the years 2003 and 2005, a discovery that provided the definitive, physical confirmation of the multi-state hunting network that had been mapped out on the command center's digital screens. The discovery of the secondary lockbox was the final blow to any hope the defense team had of constructing a manageable narrative for the upcoming trial. There was no longer any possibility of arguing that the 2006 case was an isolated, uncharacteristic incident. The steel box was a physical monument to a sustained, multi-year career of targeted predation. The items were transported to the state crime lab under an armed escort, their serial numbers, photographs, and biological profiles matched against the national database of unresolved missing persons within hours of their recovery. The families of those 4 women, scattered across 3 different states, received the phone calls they had been dreading and praying for nearly a generation, their private nightmares finally intersecting with the absolute, unyielding reality of the forensic data pulled from the Oregon soil. The legal machinery of the state was now moving with a velocity that could not be slowed by standard defense motions, with the Attorney General taking personal command of the prosecution team to ensure that the multiple indictments were coordinated with absolute precision. They decided to proceed with the 2006 biochemistry student's case as the primary trial vehicle, using the pristine evidence from the vault and the unassailable witness statement to secure an immediate, permanent life sentence, while simultaneously preparing the secondary indictments for the other victims to ensure that the suspect would face a continuous, inescapable wall of justice for the rest of his natural life. The suspect sat in his maximum security isolation cell, entirely cut off from his financial accounts, his legal team reduced to a public defender specialized in capital cases after his corporate assets were permanently frozen under state racketeering laws. The final report from the computer forensics unit on the standalone server rack was delivered to the primary investigator on the eve of the formal indictment hearings, the text filling 3 massive binders that sat on his desk like a physical manifestation of the truth. The analysis proved that the suspect had actively monitored the police department's internal radio frequencies during the initial 48 hours of the 2006 investigation, using a high-end scanning array hidden inside his garden cottage to track the movements of the search teams and adjust his own camouflage accordingly. He had been 1 step ahead of the law, not because of luck, but because he had actively intelligence mapped the precinct's operations, exploiting the limitations of their analog communication systems to ensure that his dumping ground remained entirely outside their geographic focus. The primary investigator stood by the window of the empty precinct, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall across the city streets, blanketing the cars, the buildings, and the sidewalks in a quiet, clinical white layer that seemed to mirror the finality of the forensic evidence on his desk. The long, dark night that began in the rain of 2006 had expanded into a multi-decade winter that had frozen the lives of dozens of families across the country, but the thaw had finally arrived, driven forward by the absolute, unyielding persistence of an unexpected voice and the precision of modern science. The files were ready, The evidence was ironclad, and the monster was finally locked in the dark where he belonged, his secrets exhumed, his power broken, and his name permanently written into the history of the state as a symbol of total, unmitigated defeat. The mystery was over. The questions had been answered with the cold, hard, and undeniable facts of the excavation, and the town was finally, truly free to look toward the horizon without the fear of what lay hidden beneath their boots. The story of the 1986 disappearance was no longer a cold case. It was a resolved, historical reality that had been brought to its rightful conclusion in the blinding light of the law, leaving behind a legacy of survival, of determination, and of the absolute power of the truth over the cowardice of a life built on a lie. The long wait was finished, the files were sealed, and as the lights of the city flickered on in the quiet dusk, the future belonged, at last, entirely and irrevocably to the living, unburdened by the phantoms of the past, free to walk forward into the light of a new, honest tomorrow. The sixth phase of this historical excavation marked the definitive transition from active field recovery to the high-stakes, subterranean arena of financial and administrative warfare. Now that the secondary lockbox had physically anchored the suspect to multiple unresolved disappearances across 3 state lines, the investigation shifted its primary weight from the mud of the Timberland plot into the clinical, fluorescent-lit offices of the state's Financial Crimes Division and the Federal Asset Forfeiture Unit. Investigators realized that to completely dismantle the suspect's 40-year empire of silence, they had to understand exactly how his corporate infrastructure had been used to fund, insulate, and conceal his predatory career. The logistics firm, once viewed as a shining example of regional economic success, was now treated by federal prosecutors as a massive, multi-layered criminal enterprise, a corporate shield specifically engineered to facilitate the untraceable movement of a predator across the geography of the Pacific Northwest. Forensic accountants, working in absolute secrecy inside a secured room at the state capitol, began the systematic dissection of 40 years of corporate tax records, shipping manifests, and private bank accounts associated with the suspect's shell corporations. They sat beneath the constant hum of high-velocity servers, their eyes tracking the movement of millions of dollars across international borders, looking for the subtle, anomalous financial pings that occurred during the specific weeks when a young woman had vanished from a campus or a transport corridor. What they uncovered was a masterclass in structural corruption. The suspect had systematically utilized his company's interstate commerce credits to fund a private, entirely off-the-books network of real estate acquisitions, purchasing isolated parcels of land along his primary shipping routes that served as temporary staging areas and deep field disposal sites for his crimes. The financial lines on the projection screens displayed a terrifyingly calculated pattern of corporate asset diversion, showing that every single major advancement in his predatory career had been preceded by a specific, structured expansion of his logistics firm's real estate portfolio. He hadn't just used his wealth to buy silence after the fact. He had actively used his corporate infrastructure to pre-engineer his immunity, integrating his hunting grounds directly into the tax-sheltered assets of his commercial enterprise. The realization that hundreds of local investors, community leaders, and ordinary citizens had unwittingly contributed to the funding of this infrastructure sent a wave of profound, nauseating shock through the local economic sector, forcing municipal boards to immediately initiate emergency liquidation protocols to prevent the total collapse of the town's credit rating. The documentation revealed that the suspect possessed an advanced, highly sophisticated understanding of maritime and interstate transport loopholes, utilizing specialized bills of lading to move equipment and materials across state lines without ever triggering the standard reporting requirements of the Department of Transportation. He had built a private, ghost network that existed entirely within the blind spots of the regional regulatory agencies, using his flawless corporate compliance record as an unassailable shield against the curiosity of state troopers and way station inspectors. He knew exactly which shipping lanes were unmonitored during the late-night hours, which rural routes offered the maximum isolation from cellular tracking, and how to use corporate fuel cards to obscure his physical location during the critical 48 hours following an abduction. The primary investigator, a man whose entire professional identity had been forged in the furnace of the 2006 campus path, stood at the central conference table of the Financial Crimes Division, his fingers tracing the complex corporate trees that linked the suspect's main logistics hub to a dozen separate holding companies in offshore jurisdictions. He held a copy of the suspect's corporate itineraries from the mid-2000s, a series of leather-bound appointment books that had been seized during the initial tactical breach of the master mansion. When these itineraries were overlaid with the newly recovered financial data, the correlation was absolute. Every corporate retreat, every private property inspection, and every regional supply audit noted in his calendar corresponded precisely to a date when a family had been plunged into the living hell of an unresolved missing person investigation. To read the financial line items was to witness the clinical commodification of absolute horror, with the suspect listing the expenses associated with his deep field maintenance operations under standard corporate categories like structural upkeep, site clearance, and security refinement. He had treated the preservation of his hidden vault and the insulation of his burial sites with the exact same administrative precision that he used to manage his commercial distribution hubs, writing off the costs of concrete reinforcement and high-end air filtration systems as routine business deductions on his annual state tax returns. The detective dropped the folder onto the desk, the sound of the heavy paper echoing through the silent room like a terminal blow, the realization setting in that the suspect had essentially forced the state itself to subsidize the infrastructure of his depravity through decades of masterful tax fraud. While the financial teams excavated the corporate ledgers, the digital forensics unit achieved a monumental breakthrough inside the standalone server rack's deepest, multi-layered encryption sectors. Using advanced, high-velocity decryption algorithms that had been specifically updated to bypass the suspect's proprietary security sequences, the technical analysts successfully reconstructed a massive, deleted database labeled Project Sentinel. This archive did not contain standard business data or simple digital surveillance files. It was an extensive, cross-indexed repository of police scanner logs, internal law enforcement memos, and public relations strategies that the suspect had compiled over a span of 25 years. It was proof of active counterintelligence, a systematic, long-term operation to monitor, predict, and manipulate the very agencies that were tasked with hunting him down. The reconstructed database showed that the suspect had utilized a sophisticated network of high-frequency listening arrays hidden within the attic space of his detached garden cottage, allowing him to capture and record the analog radio traffic of 5 separate county sheriff departments during the critical phases of his active crimes. He hadn't just been lucky. He had been operating with a superior level of situational awareness, tracking the movements of the police search teams in real time, listening to the dispatchers coordinate the deployment of K-9 units, and adjusting his own movements to ensure that his transport vehicles never intersected with the path of the investigators. He had turned the regional law enforcement network into a predictable, manageable variable that he could systematically outmaneuver using their own communication protocols against them. The implications of Project Sentinel tore through the department like a physical shockwave, shifting the investigation from a localized cold case into a massive, internal security audit that threatened to expose deep vulnerabilities in the state's regional communications infrastructure. The lead tech expert demonstrated that the suspect had even managed to intercept encrypted email transmissions from the early 2000s, utilizing early-generation network vulnerabilities to monitor the internal discussions of the original 2006 task force, allowing him to see exactly which leads the detectives were pursuing and which suspects they were prioritizing. He sat behind his desk, watching the police chase ghosts for 20 years, his immense narcissism fed daily by the knowledge that he was actively reading the thoughts of the men who had sworn to bring him to justice. Outside the secure boundaries of the precinct, the public relations fallout from the exposure of Project Sentinel was creating an atmosphere of total, absolute paranoia within the city's political establishment. Local newspapers and independent investigative journals began publishing frantic, daily updates on the suspect's historical interactions with former chiefs of police, district attorneys, and county judges, revealing a complex web of campaign contributions, private dinners, and honorary board appointments that dated back to the late 1980s. The realization that the ultimate predator had been a major financial backer of the very individuals responsible for maintaining public safety shattered the community's remaining trust in their local institutions, replacing the quiet confidence of the suburb with an explosive, angry demand for a total federal takeover of the county government. The local university, which had served as the physical backdrop for the 2006 tragedy, was caught in its own structural crisis, with the student body organizing massive, non-stop sit-ins outside the administration building, demanding an immediate independent investigation into the school's historical security failures. Old campus security logs, exhumed under public records requests, revealed that in the weeks following the biochemistry student's disappearance, several security guards had reported seeing the suspect's corporate delivery vehicles parked near the oak-lined paths during unauthorized hours. But these reports had been systematically dismissed by senior administrators who didn't want to disrupt the university's financial relationship with the region's largest logistical employer. The weight of this historical negligence was heavy, toxic, and entirely unresolvable, turning a place of higher learning into a monument of institutional complicity. The unexpected witness, whose initial break in silence had initiated this catastrophic collapse of the suspect's empire, had finished their final, definitive deposition for the state attorney general's office, the text of their testimony now locked within a high-security archive that served as the primary legal engine for the upcoming multi-jurisdictional indictments. The witness had spent 7 consecutive days inside the secure military facility, guided by trauma-informed specialists through the deep, terrifying caverns of their own memory, pulling out the exact names, dates, and commands that linked the suspect's corporate operations directly to the physical concealment of the multiple victims. They recounted how the suspect would routinely use his corporate authority to order the immediate destruction of digital vehicle logs from specific weekends, forcing the witness to manually purge the server backups while he stood behind their chair, his hand resting lightly on the back of their neck in a silent, continuous demonstration of absolute mortal dominance. To read the final pages of that deposition is to witness the slow, meticulous resurrection of a human soul from the ash heap of total psychological destruction, the witness's words transitioning from the fragmented, panic-driven whispers of the initial interview into a hard, crystalline narrative of resistance that possessed the absolute finality of a death sentence. They described the profound sense of liberation that came from finally delivering the truth to the state, an internal shift that allowed them to look at the photographs of the victims not with the paralyzing guilt of an unwilling accomplice, but with the quiet, determined focus of a person who had finally chosen to serve as the ultimate instrument of their reckoning. The witness had done more than just provide a lead. They had broken the spell of terror that had kept the county paralyzed for a generation, proving that even the most meticulously engineered system of deception will eventually fail if a single human conscience refuses to completely die. Late on a Thursday afternoon, the state medical examiner's office delivered the definitive forensic anthropology reports on the secondary artifacts recovered from the Timberland parcel's hidden steel lockbox, the documentation providing the ironclad, scientific links that the prosecution needed to permanently secure the suspect's lifetime incarceration across multiple state jurisdictions. The analysis confirmed that the identity cards, driver's licenses, and jewelry items had been exposed to the exact same chemical and environmental variables found inside the forest clearing, proving that they had been curated and deposited by the same individual who had executed the 1986 burial. Every single object was a pristine, high-fidelity match for a missing person profile that had been dormant in the federal databases for 20 years, transforming the abstract theories of the regional detectives into an indisputable, physical certainty that left the defense team entirely bereft of any remaining legal strategy. The primary investigator sat at his desk in the quiet center of the cold case unit, the 3 massive binders containing the complete financial and digital analysis of Project Sentinel resting before him like a permanent monument to the truth. The walls of his office, which for 20 years had been covered in the chaotic, unresolved maps of the 2006 task force, were now entirely clean, the names and dates transferred into the formal legal indices of the state's indictment paperwork. He looked out the window at the city below, watching the evening traffic move through the winter slush, the flashing blue lights of a routine patrol car casting a rhythmic, familiar reflection against the glass of his office window. There was no elation in his chest, no sudden burst of professional triumph. There was only the immense, heavy, and grounding peace that comes from a long-delayed duty finally and completely fulfilled to the dead. The transport order for the suspect was signed by the state Supreme Court Justice